"Children aren't allowed in my car," my father said while my 5-year-old daughter struggled to breathe against my shoulder. The emergency room was 8 minutes away, and his Lexus was sitting right outside. My mother just told me to figure something else out. Then my wealthy aunt quietly picked up her keys. Why did that one move make both my parents go pale? Emma stopped drawing in the middle of a yellow sun. 1 second, she was kneeling on my parents' side patio with chalk in her hand. The next, she pressed that hand to her chest and looked up at me. "Mom." The word came out thin. I was beside her before the chalk hit the concrete. Her shoulders lifted too high with every breath, and I heard the tight wheeze I had learned never to ignore. I pulled out her rescue inhaler, attached the spacer, and followed the asthma action plan exactly as her doctor had taught me. 1 puff, slow breaths, then the second. I checked the time. Usually, her body began to relax within a minute or two. That afternoon, nothing changed. She was still breathing too fast, her fingers curled into my collar. "We're going in," I told her. My car was at the garage waiting on a radiator repair. The pediatric emergency room was less than 10 minutes away. If Emma got worse, I was ready to call 911. I carried her inside. My parents were in the dining room with my Aunt Vivian. China cups, a silver tray, and my father's Lexus keys sat on the table. My mother looked annoyed before she looked worried. I told them Emma was having an asthma flare. The rescue inhaler had not settled her breathing, and her doctor had told me to take her to the emergency room if that happened. Then I looked at my father. "Please drive us or give me the keys and I'll drive." He did not stand. He did not ask how Emma felt. Instead, he placed 2 fingers over the keys. "Children aren't allowed in my car." For a moment, I thought I had heard him wrong. Emma was breathing against my shoulder. The hospital was minutes away. The car was in the driveway. The keys were right there. I did not need my father to understand asthma. I needed him to look at his granddaughter and act like a human being. I turned to my mother. She glanced at Vivian, then back at me. "Figure something else out." There are people who do not have to raise their voices to make you feel unworthy of help. They simply stay calm while you are desperate. I reached for my phone. If they would not help, I would call 911. Vivian had been silent the entire time. Too silent. I had spent years being told she disliked children, disliked disorder, and wanted nothing to do with complicated lives. Then her chair moved across the floor. Vivian stood up. Both of my parents went pale. I did not understand why. To understand that reaction, I have to tell you about the small room behind my parents' laundry area where Emma and I had been living for the weeks before that afternoon. The room beside the laundry was barely a room at all. 3 weeks earlier, a pipe had burst behind the bathroom wall in the duplex Emma and I rented. I thought it would mean a noisy repair. Then the contractor opened the wall and found soaked insulation, damp wood, and signs of mold. Emma's pediatrician was clear. With her asthma, she should not be sleeping around dust, moisture, or active remediation. If I had another option, I priced extended stay hotels, then stared at the total until the numbers stopped looking real. Friends offered a couch for a night or two, but I needed something stable. So I called my parents. They said yes. For a few minutes, I let myself believe that meant we were welcome. When Emma and I arrived with 2 suitcases, her medication bag, and a laundry basket, my mother looked past us at the bags. "How long is this going to be?" Not "come in." Not "are you okay?" Just how long? I told her the contractor expected 3 weeks, maybe 4. My father said they were not rearranging the whole house for us. The upstairs guest room was available, but my mother said it was full of things she did not want moved. Instead, she led us to a narrow room beside the laundry area. It had a daybed, 1 lamp, and just enough floor space for Emma's stuffed animals. Emma smiled. "It's like camping." I smiled back because she needed me to. Then the rules started. No toys in the living room, no television early in the morning. Do not use the good towels. Do not cook after 7, because my father hated kitchen smells. If Emma coughed at night, keep the door closed so she would not wake anyone. A few days later, my mother moved Emma's cereal to the lowest pantry shelf behind a basket of napkins. Every time irritation rose, I told myself the same thing. Just a few weeks. Dependence does not only cost money, it makes you inspect every sentence before you speak, because every objection has to be weighed against a roof, a meal, and your child's safety. One night, I tucked Emma into the daybed. "Mom, are Grandma and Grandpa mad that we live here?" I fixed the blanket even though it was already straight. "Different houses have different rules," I told her. But for the first time, I wondered if my daughter was beginning to believe that her presence was the problem. I thought there was no way they could make her feel any smaller. Then my mother announced that Aunt Vivian was coming. The morning my mother announced that Aunt Vivian was coming, the whole house seemed to change. My father took his Lexus to be detailed before breakfast. My mother brought out the silver tea service she kept wrapped in cloth at the back of a cabinet. She replaced the flowers, checked the dining table twice, then reminded me that Vivian appreciated quiet. What she really meant was that Emma and I needed to stay out of sight. My mother told me not to leave toys in the living room. She said there was no need to mention the damage at our duplex or what the repairs were costing me. She also asked me not to bring up money, work, or anything that might become, as she put it, a conversation about problems. That wording stayed with me. All my life, Vivian had been described as someone with little patience for children, noise, or people who could not keep their lives in order. My parents said she valued privacy. They said she disliked emotional demands. They said she did not want children around her things or adults asking her for help. At least, that was the version of her I had been given. When I finally stopped and thought about it, I could not remember Vivian ever saying any of those things to me. Almost everything I believed about her had come through my parents. Later that morning, I passed the kitchen and heard my father speaking quietly. "We need her comfortable today." My mother answered too softly for me to catch the rest. I kept walking, but something in me paused. I used to think families controlled each other with enormous secrets. Later I learned that sometimes all they have to control is who gets to speak directly to whom. Just before lunch, my phone buzzed. My mother had texted me from 20 feet away. "Please keep Emma outside while Vivian is here. You know how she feels about children." I stared at the message. I did not save it because I was building a case. I simply left it there because I was tired of being told later that I had misunderstood what was said. That afternoon, I took Emma outside like my mother asked. Less than an hour later, she set down her piece of chalk. Then she stopped talking. The silence lasted less than a second. Then I heard the wheeze. It was thin and tight, almost like air being pulled through something too small. Emma was still standing, but her shoulders were lifting with every breath. I sat her down on the patio step and reached for the medication bag. "Stay with me, sweetheart." She nodded. I attached the spacer to her rescue inhaler and gave her the first puff. I counted the breaths with her, then gave the second. After that, I checked the time on my phone and watched. I was not waiting for a miracle. I was looking for the small changes I usually saw when the medicine worked. Her shoulders would drop. Her breathing would slow. She would start talking normally again. None of that happened. Emma was still awake. She could answer me, but only in short pieces. "My chest feels tight." That was enough. Her lips were still their normal color, and she was not losing consciousness. But I knew our plan. If the rescue medicine did not bring her back toward normal, we did not sit around hoping. We went to the emergency room. If she stopped being able to speak, I would call 911 immediately. I picked her up and went inside. I did not use the side door. I did not stop to wonder whether I was interrupting Vivian. When your child is working that hard just to breathe, rules designed to protect someone else's comfort suddenly become very small. I carried Emma straight through the front hall and into the dining room. My mother looked at me first. Vivian looked at Emma. That difference registered somewhere in me. I explained what was happening and told them the rescue inhaler had not helped enough. I said we needed the pediatric emergency room now. My father's keys were beside his teacup. He had joked before that his Lexus had 3 rules: no food, no pets, no kids. I had always assumed the last one was mostly about keeping the leather clean. Dad, please drive us. Or let me drive. He looked at the keys, then at me. Children aren't allowed in my car. My mother glanced toward Vivian. Natalie, don't create a scene. That was the moment something changed for me. There is a difference between not understanding an emergency and understanding it well enough to refuse help anyway. I stopped making excuses for them. I pulled out my phone. The rideshare estimate was too long. My thumb moved toward 911. Then I heard Vivian's chair scrape against the floor. My aunt stood up. Vivian did not raise her voice. She looked at Emma first, then at me. Get her booster. Bring her medication bag. For half a second, I just stared at her. Then I moved behind me. My father said we were making too much of it. He sounded irritated, like the real problem was that the afternoon had been interrupted. Vivian turned toward him. A 5-year-old struggling to breathe is not an inconvenience. That was all. My mother started to say that I had always been the type to overreact. Vivian did not argue with her. She simply picked up her keys and headed for the front door. I followed. There was something almost shocking about how quickly the room changed once one person decided to act. My father's hand had covered his keys to keep them from me. Vivian closed her hand around hers because she intended to use them. It was such a small difference, it felt enormous. People sometimes mistake composure for coldness, especially in women who do not perform warmth for everyone around them. I had done that with Vivian because I had been taught to. Now I was watching her move through an emergency with more care than the people who had called themselves our family every day of my life. I grabbed Emma's booster and medication bag from the room near the laundry area. Vivian was already outside. My parents had followed us onto the porch. My father called after her that the hospital was unnecessary. Vivian did not turn around. She opened the back door while I secured the booster, then asked me which pediatric emergency room Emma's doctor used. Once I gave her the name, she entered it into the navigation system and chose the fastest route. No speeches, no panic, just useful questions. When Emma said, her chest still felt tight, Vivian lowered the radio and asked whether she could still speak comfortably. I answered for her when I saw Emma getting tired. Vivian nodded and kept driving. I looked back through the rear window as we pulled away. My parents were still standing on the porch. My father looked angry. My mother looked different. She looked afraid. Not worried about Emma, afraid of Vivian. I remember wondering why. Why would my aunt driving us to the hospital frighten my mother that much? I did not have time to solve it. The pediatric emergency entrance came into view, and Vivian pulled beneath the awning. The doors opened before I had fully unbuckled Emma. A nurse took one look at her breathing and brought us straight inside. Only a few minutes had passed since we left my parents' house. Already, complete strangers were taking my daughter's breathing more seriously than her own grandparents had. The emergency room moved with a quiet urgency that made everything feel faster and slower at once. A nurse clipped a monitor onto Emma's finger and watched the oxygen number. Another listened to her lungs. Then came the nebulizer mask, its soft hiss filling the space between us. They kept Emma for observation and gave her a second breathing treatment. Little by little, the strain left her shoulders. Her breaths were tired, but they were no longer fighting their way out. That was the first moment I let myself sit back. Vivian was still there. She had carried my bag, found water, and stayed out of the nurse's way. She never asked whether I thought the visit was necessary. When Emma finally fell asleep under a thin hospital blanket, I looked across at Vivian. "Thank you," I said, "and I'm sorry I dragged you into family drama." Vivian studied me. "Why would you think helping Emma is drama?" The question embarrassed me more than anger would have. I told her what I had heard for years, that she liked distance, that she did not enjoy children, that she had no patience for people bringing problems into her life. Vivian looked confused. "Who told you that?" "My parents." She said she had been told almost the opposite. According to my mother, I valued my independence and did not want Vivian interfering. I preferred privacy. I would reach out if I wanted help. I opened my phone. The message from earlier was still there. "Please keep Emma outside while Vivian is here. You know how she feels about children." Vivian read it slowly. Then she opened her messages and found one from my mother. "Natalie values her privacy. Please don't contact her directly. She'll reach out if she needs anything." We sat there, holding two phones. Nothing else needed explaining. I had spent years believing Vivian had chosen not to know me. That night, I began to understand that maybe neither of us had been allowed to choose that distance. Sometimes controlling a relationship does not require one enormous lie. It only takes enough small messages. "She does not want you. Do not call. Leave her alone." Then Vivian asked why Emma and I were living with my parents. I explained the damaged wall, the mold, and the temporary move. Then she asked something that seemed unrelated. "Is Robert still driving the Lexus?" "Yes." "Why?" Vivian looked down at her phone. She did not answer. I thought I had discovered that my parents had lied to keep us apart. I had no idea that one question about the Lexus was about to explain why they had gone pale the moment Vivian stood up. Before Vivian could explain why the Lexus mattered, my phone vibrated against the hospital chair. My mother's name filled the screen. For 1 second, I thought she was calling to ask about Emma. I let it go to voicemail because Emma was still asleep beside me, the pulse ox clip glowing on one finger. A minute later, the message appeared. My mother said I had frightened Vivian, turned an asthma episode into a crisis, and ruined an important afternoon. She said my father had always had rules about his car, and that I could have called an ambulance instead of humiliating them in front of Vivian. Then her voice became almost gentle. "Emma was probably scared because you were panicking." I looked at my daughter. She had needed 2 breathing treatments and steroid medication. I had followed her action plan. I had kept my voice steady. I had moved when the medicine did not help enough. And somehow my mother had made Emma's fear my fault. Some people do not deny what happened. They change the story just enough that they no longer have to be responsible for it. For years, I believed better explanations would make my parents understand me. That night, something finally clicked. When someone needs you to be wrong so they can remain right, understanding is not what they are looking for. I saved the voicemail. 20 minutes later, my father texted me a photograph. Our 2 suitcases were stacked beside the side door. Emma's spare medication bag sat on my laundry basket. Her stuffed rabbit was wedged beside a small bag of toys. Under the picture he had written, "You made your choice. Pick this up tonight or I'll put it outside tomorrow." He had not asked whether Emma was okay. He was throwing us out while his granddaughter was still under hospital observation. My first instinct was to call him. I wanted to ask what kind of grandfather punished a 5-year-old for having an asthma attack. Vivian looked at my face. "Don't call him yet." I stopped. Then I took a screenshot. I saved the message and emailed a copy to myself. I did not know whether I would ever need it. I only knew that people who rewrite history have a harder time doing it when history has a timestamp. Vivian studied the photograph. Robert has no idea how much trouble he just created for himself. I looked at her. She shook her head. "I'm not talking about revenge." Then she pointed toward the screen. "He's threatening to throw you out of a house he doesn't own." "What do you mean?" "Tomorrow I'll show you." If you are still listening, please leave a comment below sharing your level of satisfaction. It lets me know that I have companions joining me on this journey. Your presence is the greatest source of encouragement for me to go on and tell the final part. The next morning, Emma was discharged with instructions to rest, keep using her medication as directed, and follow up with her pediatrician. Vivian drove us to her house. I had expected something grand because that was how my parents always spoke about her money. Instead, her home was comfortable and quiet. Nothing was arranged to impress anyone. There were books on the coffee table, a sweater over the back of a chair, and a kitchen that looked like people actually cooked in it. Emma fell asleep almost immediately. Once I knew she was settled, Vivian brought a thin folder to the dining table. "This is what I meant about the house," she said. She explained that my grandparents had placed the property into a family trust years ago. My parents had the right to live there under certain terms, but they did not own it the way I had always assumed. Vivian managed the trust with an administrator. Then she turned to the Lexus. After my father retired, his finances had become tighter than he admitted. He wanted to keep the car because, in his words, it made him feel successful. Vivian had agreed to help with part of the monthly lease for a little while. A little while had become nearly 3 years. She had also covered part of the property taxes, paid for a roof repair, and helped with insurance during one difficult year. I sat there staring at the folder. My parents had made me feel ashamed for needing a safe place for a few weeks. Yet much of the life they used to look down on me was being supported by someone else. Then I caught myself. Needing help was not what made them wrong. I needed help too. The problem was what they did with the little power they had. They used it to make Emma and me feel smaller. For a moment, I expected Vivian to say she was taking everything away. Instead, she closed the folder. "No, I don't make financial decisions when I'm angry." She said she would speak with the trust administrator, review the voluntary support, and handle everything properly. That told me more about her than any threat could have. Real power, I was beginning to understand, was not about acting quickly because you could. Sometimes it was knowing exactly when not to. Then Vivian looked toward the hallway where Emma was sleeping. "You can both stay here as long as you need." "Until the apartment is safe," I said. "Then I want us back in our own place." She nodded. No argument, no guilt, just respect. A few minutes later, her phone started buzzing. Family messages. One of them read, "I heard Natalie used Emma's asthma to turn Vivian against her own sister." That was when I understood. My parents were not preparing to apologize. They were preparing their version of the story. The first family message did not stay alone for long. By lunchtime, my phone was filling with texts from relatives. The story traveling through the family was careful. Emma had never really been in danger. I had overreacted. My father had only refused to let me drive his car. Vivian had misunderstood. Somehow I had used Emma's asthma to get sympathy and money. Then a cousin called and repeated something my father had told him. According to Robert, I had reached for my keys without permission. That stopped me. Until then, they had been changing tone. Now they were changing facts. I opened the family group chat and started typing. Then I deleted everything. If I answered every accusation, I would spend the day living inside their version of what happened. Instead, I made a folder on my laptop and named it Emma, Ear. Inside, I saved her asthma action plan, the discharge papers, the treatment times, my mother's message telling me to keep Emma outside, her voicemail blaming me, the photograph of our belongings by the side door, and my father's threat. I was not preparing to destroy anyone. I was protecting the record. I used to think people kept evidence because they were preparing for court. Later, I understood that sometimes evidence protects something more basic: your own memory. Gaslighting works best when you begin wondering whether you made too much of what happened. A photograph, a message, or a discharge paper can keep your feet on solid ground. Vivian sent one message to the family group. I was present. Emma was struggling to breathe. Her mother followed the treatment plan and requested transportation. Robert refused. I drove them to the ER, where Emma received respiratory treatment. Those are the facts. Then she added, "Do not attribute statements to me that I did not make. Nothing else." That was when I understood her strength. It was not the money. She spoke carefully and did not argue with distortion. Maybe that was the independence I wanted. Not just money to leave, but enough confidence to stop begging people to agree with what I knew had happened. Later, an older relative called me privately. "This isn't the first time your mother has told two people different versions of the same conversation." I believed her. But I did not need to investigate 30 years of family history. What happened in front of me was enough. That evening, Vivian's phone rang. It was the trust administrator. She listened. Then she said, "All right, end the discretionary payments at the end of the month." For the first time, my parents' choices were about to have consequences they could not explain away. The trust administrator confirmed what Vivian had already expected. My parents were not being removed from the house. They still had the right to live there under the existing trust terms. What changed were the things Vivian had chosen to pay for on top of that. The monthly help with my father's Lexus lease would end. So would part of the insurance support, the household allowance, and several temporary expenses that had somehow stayed temporary for years. Everything was put in writing. Everything had an effective date. There were no threats, no dramatic phone calls, just consequences. My father called me 6 times that afternoon. I did not answer. On the 7th call, he left a voicemail. "Do you understand what you've done?" I listened to it twice. Not because I was confused, because I noticed what was missing. He did not ask how Emma was doing. He did not say he was sorry. He did not ask whether I was all right. He asked what I had done to them. That was how he still saw it. The consequences had arrived, so someone else had to be responsible for them. The next morning, my parents showed up at Vivian's house without calling first. Vivian opened the door. I stood a few feet behind her. For once, I did not hide. My mother said I had turned Vivian against them. Vivian answered in the same calm voice she always used. Natalie didn't tell me what happened. I watched it happen. My father said this was family business. Vivian looked at him. Exactly. She explained that the extra financial support had always been voluntary. She was no longer willing to fund a lifestyle that was being used to make other people feel small. My father turned toward me. Are you happy now? Months earlier, I might have tried to explain myself. That day, I did not. No, I would have been happy if you had driven Emma to the hospital. The porch went quiet. I used to think justice meant making the person who hurt you feel the same pain. I do not believe that anymore. Sometimes justice is simply refusing to protect people from the consequences of choices they made themselves. My mother looked at me differently after that. The anger left her face. Then she started to cry. After everything we did for you, You're really going to keep our granddaughter from us? That was when I understood the money had never been the final fight. Emma was. I went back to my parents' house 3 days later to collect what was left. Vivian came with me, but she stayed outside. A longtime friend brought her SUV so I would have room for the boxes. Emma stayed with someone I trusted. That part was not negotiable. I was done asking my daughter to stand inside rooms where adults discussed whether she deserved kindness. The little room beside the laundry looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it had always been that small. Maybe fear and dependence had made me believe I needed more space from my parents than I actually did. My father stood in the doorway while I packed. After a while, he said, "I shouldn't have said it the way I did." I waited. He never said he should have helped Emma. My mother said they had been under a lot of stress because Vivian was visiting. She said things had gotten out of hand. Again, the apology was about the situation, not the choice. A real apology does not make you search through the words for the part where someone accepts responsibility. When "I'm sorry" is followed by an explanation of why you were partly to blame, it often means they want the old arrangement back. My mother finally said, "We're still her grandparents." I closed the box in front of me. That's a relationship. It isn't a guarantee of access. I told them there would be no direct contact with Emma for now. They were not to come to her school or our home. They were not to send messages through relatives. If there came a time when they could take responsibility without blaming me, Vivian, or Emma, I would decide what happened next. They did not like that. I did not need them to. Emma was not going to become proof that they had been forgiven. Before I left, I noticed a box of sidewalk chalk on the shelf near the door. Emma's chalk. I picked it up and put it in my bag. It seemed like such a small thing, but I refused to leave it behind. For weeks, my daughter had been asked to make herself smaller in that house. Now, even her chalk was coming home with us. I carried the last box outside and closed my friend's car door. When it was not a Lexus. It did not need to be. I looked at my parents' house one last time. I had once thought leaving would be the ending. The harder, better part was learning how to build a life where Emma would never again have to ask whether her existence was bothering someone. A few months later, the remediation work on our duplex was finally finished. Emma and I went home. Not to a bigger place, just back to the rooms we knew, with the same small kitchen table and the same afternoon light. That mattered to me. I went back to work, replaced my unreliable car with a used one I could afford, and started putting a little money aside each month. The emergency fund was small, but it was mine. Vivian never tried to make herself necessary. She came for dinner, took Emma to pick out books, and showed up for a school performance. Before every visit, she called, "Is this a good time?" That question stayed with me. The woman I had been taught to believe hated inconvenience was the person who understood that respect had to work both ways. My parents stayed in the house under the trust. They were not homeless. They simply had to live closer to what they could afford. I heard that my father eventually gave up the Lexus. My mother stopped hosting quite so many polished gatherings. For a while, those details interested me. Then they stopped. That was how I knew I was finally free. The biggest change was not that my parents lost financial help. It was that I no longer needed them to admit they had hurt me before I allowed myself to protect my daughter. One evening, Emma sat at our kitchen table drawing on a small chalkboard with the same sidewalk chalk I had carried out of my parents' house. She looked up. "Mom, is Aunt Vivian our real family? What do you think?" Emma thought for a moment. "She comes when we need her." Children sometimes understand in one sentence what adults spend years making complicated. I told her, family is not only the people we are related to. Family is the people who make room for us when life gets hard. I used to believe blood gave someone a permanent place in your life. Now I think blood creates a connection. Love, responsibility, and how someone shows up decide what that connection is worth. I also learned not to build my opinion of someone from another person's version of them. I lost years with Vivian because I believed a story she had never been allowed to tell for herself. If you were in my place, would you give my parents another chance after what happened to Emma? Or would you put your child's safety ahead of blood ties too? And on a scale from 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with the way I handled everything? Let me know in the comments.